Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of Gun Guys. Bill Wilson here with my old buddy Ken Hackathorn, and today we're going to talk about the evolution of sights on the practical pistol. And what do we got here, Ken?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that we often are told, Bill, is how competition drives the development of, say, guns or cars. If you look at a racing business, it's competition. Let's face it, things we take for granted now, like disc brakes. And better suspension systems and better tires, really is kind of as a result, really, of the racing community, what it brought to the table.
Almost everything that's developed on automobiles, has come from racing. As you know, I'm a big Formula One and IndyCar fan.
And you've watched this most of your life, this evolution. And what people don't realize, particularly when you talk about sights on handguns, it really has been driven by the competition world.
Yeah.
Back in the old days, let's say the turn of the 19th century, the champion pistol shooter was a guy by the name of Ira Payne, I believe. And he was considered one of the Rob Latham of that era. And he had the Payne sight was basically a very thin blade with a little tiny bead on it. And all the sights that were U-notches. Everybody thinks U-notches are a new thing. They're actually been around since the beginning.
Oh yeah, I've got Colt shooting masters made back in the 20s and 30s that have got U-notches on.
And again, people don't realize the first really serious form of competition with pistols was dueling. Mm-hmm. And the original duelers were flintlocks and they didn't have sights. Well, somebody quickly figured out that based upon the rules of dueling, which were very formalized, you know what, if you put sights on that pistol, it actually made hitting the other guy pretty much more likely. It's easier. Yeah. So that's kind of the first step. Why did we get sights from smoothbores to the flintlocks? Was because the duelers wanted to make sure they hit their target. And that evolution had gone, but the Payne sight was a very small, little tiny bead sight with a little tiny U-notch rear. And as times went on, we discovered in order to shoot well, remember that dueling actually led to, they actually had, like in France, they had schools you could go to learn how to duel. Mm-hmm. And they formalized the first bullseye target. And as time went on, the sights kind of followed that. In America, say from the 1880s up until the first part of the 20th century, bullseye was the only pistol form of competition exist. If you shot a pistol, you shot one-handed bullseye. And if you look at a gun like this is an early Colt commercial. This is probably a 1960s era gun. It's a Honey, by the way. But if you look at the old sights, what we call GI sights, very small. And by the way, these are a vast improvement from the original 1911.
Yeah.
The original 1911 had a real narrow little front sight, and by the way, small U-notch rear. And as time went on, actually this is a post-World War II thing where the front sight is wider, excuse me, and the rear notch is actually square. And this led to what design a sight reference, which actually we'll use an example on this one right here on this Gold Cup, is what's actually referred to as a Patridge front sight. And Mr. Patridge worked for Smith & Wesson, and they had the Smith & Wesson revolver club. And they shot bullseye. And he realized that this flat-face front sight gave you a better profile for bullseye shooting. And remember, in the bullseye world, typically you shoot at a 6 o'clock hold. You hold at the bottom hole, because if you put a black sight into a black bullseye, it's hard to tell where you're at. Yeah. So they aimed at 6 o'clock, adjusted the sights so that the bullet struck approximately 2 to 2.5 inches high to put it in the X-ring. And that style of sight, you went from this sight, which unfortunately has very little light around either side. Yeah. So these are hard to pick up quickly, And it's interesting, the U.S. military stayed with this sighting system through the entire life of the 1911, which from the beginning to the end was actually way behind the times. Yeah. And in the gun that I think changed a lot of the world, when you and I started shooting practical shooting, IPSC, everybody started kind of with one of these. This was considered the gun to go to a Colt Gold Cup. And they got beautiful sights. And it's got that square notch rear and the kind of the Patridge. And this one's actually undercut, which means you get even less light reflection. Yeah. But remember, this was designed for a 6 o'clock hold on a bullseye target. The bad news was that you and I were shooting at the IPSC buff tan silhouette, and the black sights stood out real well. As a matter of fact, you and I can remember when, like the bullseye shooters, everybody had a carbide lamp or spray black
to smoke it really black,
make them real black. As soon as you took a target that's of a different color, or if it's let's say a low light stage or an overcast day or whatever, there's no light around the sides of these. I mean, you can shoot very accurately lining the sights up, but you can't really see much light. And as we get older...
Well, we could when we were younger.
Yeah, back in the days of 2015 vision.
Yeah.
But we quickly discovered that narrow notch, this is 125 thousandths, a 1/8 inch front sight, 125 thousandths notch back here. And we figured out real quick, this isn't real good. And so a couple things evolved, and this next gun is one of yours, and it kind of, the front sight and the sight picture is kind of a turning point. Why don't you tell us about that one?
Yeah, what we got here, this is when we first started doing colored inserts.
Yes.
You know, I actually went in there and put a colored insert in the rear face of the sight. And we, at about the same time, we started opening up the rear notches a little bit, so we had a little bit more light on either side. And the kind of the downside to this, compared to the current spec, fiber optic, you don't get in, the light doesn't increase the brightness of this insert. I mean, it's just red. So it still draws you out of the front sight because it's a different color. And it was a step forward for
it was a big step at the time.
A lot of
from the all black sights.
From the all black sights.
And it's interesting, back in the 1930s, a company called the King Gun Sight Company started making specialty sights, which you've seen both like on the Smith & Registered Magnums and the high-end Colt shooting masters and stuff. And the officer, they had red inserts and gold beads and a lot of other different things. So people started figuring out, we got to find out, remember when you're shooting iron sights, your number one goal is to see the front sight. I tell people the rear sight is an aperture you look through to see the front sight. That's where your focus needs to be. Guys tell me all the time, well, I want dots on the rear sight. I go, dude, you're not supposed to be looking at the rear sight. You're supposed to be looking through it to see this thing here. And this really was this probably dates into the late 70s when this became, everybody wanted red insert. You remember the guys with the fingernail polish painting the sights and all that stuff? That was also, I can find that front sight.
Yeah, that was a late 70s, early 80s deal. And then, we started having some night shoot stuff. And so that's when the evolution of Tritium night sights comes in.
Yeah.
And like here, this one here is a dual color Tritium night sight. We've got a bright green insert in the front and a subdued orange in the rear. So in the dark, you can make sure which one's which.
And it's interesting. You're right, too. Everybody assumes that night sights were a byproduct of, say, law enforcement demand. But it really wasn't.
No, it was competition. Just so we could shoot
when low light stages, night or dark stages came in, everybody said, I got to have an edge. And then that demand, I can remember when the first guys showed up at some of the low light stages and they just had a Tritium front sight. It wasn't even Tritium. I think it was another product. It wasn't very bright. But you know what? They did better than everybody else.
Yeah.
Okay. As I always tell people, when you're shooting in the dark, and I love this. Guys tell me, well, I don't think you should have night sights on your gun because if you can't identify your target, you shouldn't be shooting. You want to bitch slap those people. Because remember, you need to know where your gun's pointed.
Yeah.
And you need to identify your target. But after that, if I told somebody, so somebody's shooting at you, but you can't identify them, so you don't return fire, right? Yeah. Night sights are definitely an aid in low light, say like for home defense gun. So when people tell me you don't need them because Now, big change came about. Probably about a decade and a half ago. Yeah,
when we actually started doing fiber optic that was designed to absorb light and shoot it back at your eye, basically, and almost every company now offers some form of a fiber optic sight. And I don't know if the camera can pick this up here or not, but I mean this.
Ray Charles could see.
Yeah, I mean, it just shines. Yeah. And so, this is my personal range gun here, and I personally like the red, but there's times when the green is actually a benefit.
Let me see that, Bill. Yeah. First off, almost every manufacturer now, offers guns or some versions of guns with fiber optic front sight. It's become universal. And again, it gets back to the most critical thing of iron sight alignment is picking up that front sight.
Yeah.
And you and other companies have figured out, one, you need a wider rear notch. And I don't remember, but this say is approximately a 125 front.
Yeah.
This is probably what, a 140, 150
Yeah, it's
rear.
about a 140 rear.
140.
Yeah.
So you got more light, which means faster. So when you're going from target to target or shooting at multiple shots, finding that front sight again is real important. And this is a tremendous aid.
And the U-notch, for me, it makes centering the sight much easier. My eye just automatically wants to put the front sight in the middle of the rear notch.
And again, we have people who want to dispute the fact that U-notches versus square notches are. Remember, the square notch was based upon the patridge sight and bullseye shooting.
Yeah.
The U-notch, if you have a round object, whether it's a white dot, a fiber optic rod, a gold bead, they will naturally center on a U-notch faster. And people don't get that. But I guess when all your shooting is done on the internet, you don't pick up on that real quick.
Yeah.
But the thing I tell everybody is that the fiber optic rod is the thing that's changed the pistol shooting business dramatically. Also, because as the shooting crowd gets older and our vision begins to deteriorate, most people will find around age 50, things start changing visually.
Yeah.
And suddenly that blurry blob on the front of the gun affects the way you shoot. And we try everything from corrective lenses, but for most people I know, this has been the salvation for them.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting. You were talking about the colors. Some people prefer red, some prefer green. I typically like green, but I will tell you what my experience has been. In the wintertime, where I live, we have snow. And on a sunny day with snow, the green dots are really hard to find. The red's really is the way to go for that condition. But in essence, what you're looking for is a sight that draws your eye to it.
Yeah.
And which kind of honestly is, as much as here you are shooting, in essence, a red dot, iron sights. And what that has led to
is the red dot sight.
The red dot
and
electronic sight.
Yeah. And you've had a lot more experience with these than I have, so I'm going to let you go over the pros and cons of
they're all the rage today. I tell people, remember, all the cool kids have red dot sights on their pistols now. And I tell people, remember, they have pluses and they have minuses like everything in life. And one of the things I'm going to explain to you about red dot sight, they have really two really distinct pluses. One is if you're shooting at distance, the red dot sight is an advantage for most everybody.
I would. It depends on your skill level, but somewhere between 15 and 20 yards, they start becoming an advantage.
Beyond, the farther you go, the better they are.
Yeah, the less your skill level is, the closer in that is. An experienced shooter, I don't see any advantage of it until I go past 20 yards.
Yeah, exactly. I tell people at distance, 20 yards and back, they really do show a benefit. Number two is if you have deteriorating vision, they can actually be an asset.
Yeah.
In that, while this system requires you to look at the front sight in order to fire an accurate shot,
you can look at the target.
This system allows you to look at the target and superimpose the red dot to where you want the bull to go. Now, mind you, doesn't change trigger control issues.
Yeah.
If you jerk or snatch the trigger, it's still going to fire a bad shot, either system. Now, what I will tell you, and this is what I try to explain to people, they say, well, I want a red dot sight. What do you think? And it's real simple. What do you want the pistol for? Listen, 90% of real-world shootings, self-defense shootings, take place at 10 yards and less. Whether you're a soldier, a policeman, or in the private sector, people don't try to rob you or assault you from 25 yards away. They try to do it at 3, 4, 5 yards. That's where the fighting with handguns really takes place. 10 yards and in. At 10 yards and in, the difference between iron sights and a red dot sight are almost non-existent. As a matter of fact, this is no more accurate than iron sights at 10 yards and in, and it's not, for most people, any faster. Max, usually it's a little slower.
It's slower for me.
Now, if you shoot them a lot, we know that Max Michel's of the world and all those guys, they've shot them enough. They've shot hundreds of thousands of rounds. They've gotten pretty quick with them. But understand, so you say, well, I want for a self-defense gun, 90% of your shots are going to be in 10 yards and in, probably only 10% beyond that. And not many of them are, by the way, going to be past 15 yards. Yeah. You're talking about spending, remember, if you're going to put a quality red dot sight on it, if you're not going to put a quality gun on it, red dot, you're staking your life on something that's pretty questionable. A lot of the red dots, remember, red dot sights are an outgrowth of competition. Remember when Jerry Barnhart first showed up with the Aimpoint on his pistol? The competition world has kind of driven this, and a lot of the red dots are based upon competition. They're not based upon real life scenarios. You want to put a quality one on it. The only two I would put on a gun that I would stake my life on, first off, number one choice in my mind is the new Aimpoint ACRO. Without a doubt, this is the way to go. And it's very simple because it's an enclosed emitter. The second would be the Trijicon RMR. Both of these things are bulletproof, but the RMR is an exposed emitter. And people say, well, that's not a big deal because the way I carry it concealed, everybody now wants to carry a gun stuck down their pants, pointed at their junk with a red dot sight.
Well, all it takes is a little bit of belly length there, and now you can't. Now
I've seen that.
Your emitter's covered up.
Yeah, and people say, well, why? I had a guy. I said, well, what happens when you get water in there and water on the emitter? And they go, well, the first shot, it throws it off. Well,
which shot's most important?
Yeah. And I had a buddy, I've got a Glock 17 with an RMR on it, and I shot it for a long time. And actually, the other thing I can tell you, you add the cost. This is probably $600 optic you're going to add to the cost of the gun. And by the way, it's going to take you 1,000 rounds of ammo to get dialed in to use it. So now the cost has went exorbitantly high. And if you're a guy that carries a gun for self-defense and 90% of your shooting is going to be at under 10 yards, what benefit have you really got? Now, if for whatever you use a handgun for, which kind of goes to competition, takes you farther out.
Now it's a big advantage.
And and I was talking to Joyce about this the other night. Let's look at the shooting disciplines today. You've got two of the most popular ones, of course, is USPSA, which is actually an involvement of IPSC. And then we've got IDPA. Yeah. And by the way, it's evolving too. But in USPSA, if you were to look at the average major match and the distance from the shooter to the target,
as well as the amount of target you have to shoot at.
Small defined target. The red dot sights, most of those shots, I will wager, and mind you, I don't shoot USPSA anymore, but watching the matches, I'd say somewhere between 15, 18 yards is the average shot.
At a small target. At a small,
and often farther. Red dot sight, it starts to come in its own.
Big advantage.
If you look at IDPA, the way you and I originally, and the guys that helped us, we all looked and said, look, real world shootings take place at close range. They don't take place at 30 yards. We tended to move the targets in closer. Yeah. And by the way, a lot of people say, oh, you made it too easy. Well, no, we made it more realistic. And at those distances, really the red dot, when you're shooting at targets at 10, 12 yards and closer, you know what, which is where most of the shots are in IDPA, these things aren't really much of an advantage. And hence they're not. I know that this coming national, I think Joyce said they're going to kind of move into that carry optics.
Yeah, they have a carry optics.
I don't think it's going to be a big division because I don't see it as a huge advantage for most shooters at closer targets.
Yeah, we'll just have to wait and see.
And then you got to remember, I mean, these things are it's learning curve. You've got to. For me, it took 1,000 rounds to be able to bring that gun out and present it and have the dot where I wanted it. Now, playing with this thing, I'm looking forward to getting one of these set up on the gun for me. I found that when I presented the RMR, it felt initially like I had to come out and dip the muzzle to find the dot.
I see the same thing.
Yeah. Now, I noticed because of the size of the screen on the ACRO, that's not necessarily the case. The dot's pretty much there right for me, which is a plus. Okay. But you got to look at all the downsides with this thing. I mean, something as minor That's saying, well, this isn't a big deal. Well, it is if you live in an environment. Suppose you're somebody that lives in the northern part of the United States and the temperatures get really cold and you're carrying a gun concealed close to your body. So the optic system is probably at, let's say, 80 degrees and it's 5 degrees out and you jerk your gun out and you have to use it. Guess what?
Yeah.
You can't see much for a little bit until it's like when you're hunting. You leave your guns outside. You don't take them into the tent and warm them up.
Yeah.
With your scope, you're going to be screwed. So dust, snow, rain, belly button lint. One of my buddies borrowed mine, my Glock with the RMR on it because he wanted to try it out. And he went out to cut firewood. And on his way back, hauling the firewood back, pulling on a trailer with his four-wheeler to the pickup, he happened to see a coyote. He thought he'd jerk out my Glock 17 and put a hole in the coyote, except that RMR open emitter, the lens was covered up with sawdust.
Yeah.
So
no doubt.
The coyote lived.
Yeah, no doubt.
And so things like that you're going to be conscious of.
But on the plus side, in low light, they can be somewhat of an advantage, can't they?
Matter of fact, another thing with these things, not all of them, but for example, a new ACRO has different settings. The low settings are 2 of them for night vision. So you can wear nods and use this very effectively. Remember, it's only got like a 2 or 3 minute dot. If you're shooting a gun with an IR laser on it for nods, as you know, that dot, even on a rifle, is that big at, say, 30 yards. Well, pretty hard to make it precise. And at distance, it's really tough to make an accurate shot. This system actually has some benefits. So evolvement-wise, I think it's interesting that among many things, front sights and sights in general have kind of come the full circle. And we've kind of reached a point today where if you look at these 2 guns with fiber optic, big notch, and the red dots are kind of where the world has evolved to.
Yeah.
I think this is the trend of the future. Between you and I, whether we like it or not, this is the way the world's going. And now I think this particular brand of sight with a closed emitter is going to drive development over the next decade. We're going to see lots of changes.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced that probably the kids that are used to playing games and video games and stuff, this for them is probably a lot more natural system in many ways than this is for us.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. Well, folks, you kind of got an overview. Bill brought out some pretty guns, and we get a chance to look at where we've been and where we're going. And you need to kind of apply a little logic to what you want and what you pick. You want a sight system you can see. And remember, select the sights based upon what the requirement, what your mission is. Why do you have a gun? What do you want to use it for? If you just want it as a range gun and you want to stand back and shoot.
That's a great choice right there.
Yeah, you want to shoot rocks on the berm or you want to shoot plate racks at 25 yards, that is going to be the way to go. If you want to stick something in your belt and you want to stake your life on and it's the realistic real world distances or play, probably something with a front sight you can see, night sight, fiber optic. Remember, fiber optic, unfortunately, at night doesn't work real well in low light.
Yeah.
And one of the things, Bill, that I am really fond of is what we call the hack sight. And you offer it on the Beretta Centurion. It is basically made by Ameriglo. It's got a big, bright, fluorescent orange ring around it. And in the center, still has your tritium dot.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing about this for me is if you look at, say, compared to the fiber optic, as you can see, they both show up real well. For daylight or normal light use, this thing for me is almost as fast as fiber optic. And the other advantage is when it gets dark, I still have a tritium front sight, so I know where my gun's indexed.
Yeah.
So this is one of my favorites. I think in many ways, it kind of bridges the gap between the fiber optic and the night sight system. So I'm really fond of that. But my belief is if we kind of look at what's available, you guys, the customers, need to determine what your gun's for. What's the need? What's the mission? And then when you spec it out or you go out to procure it, you need to think in terms of, is it something I want to play as a range gun, something I want to shoot the plate rack at 25 yards with?
Yep.
this may be the way to go. If it's a gun you want to carry for self-defense, fiber optic, certainly for normal lighting conditions, night sights for low light environment, or something like this that kind of covers both bases. You need to figure out what your gun's requirements for, and then build it or buy it accordingly.
Good job.
Hey, listen, folks, stay tuned to the Wilson Combat YouTube channel. Be sure and subscribe. Bill and I are going to try to provide you with a lot of good insight and information in these future Gun Guys episodes.
Yep.
And we enjoy doing it. I hope you all find it valuable. And we'll see you down the road. Stay safe. Next time.